All right, well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is Maggie Ibrahim Taney, and I am the Alumni Director for the College of Arts and Sciences and UC Libraries. I am honored that our program this afternoon will conclude our 2021 Alumni Week celebration. Being able to have this annual tradition this year gave us the opportunity to host several virtual events and activities that have united our UC alumni and friends from all over the world. To celebrate this year's outstanding slate of alumni honorees, we're featuring 19 Bearcats through an exciting community art project, a new mural in downtown Cincinnati's vibrant Over the Rhine neighborhood. Located at 1430 Vine Street, the mural will be completed very soon and remain up through homecoming this November. And I invite you all to see it in person and you'll be blown away. None of this would have been possible without the support of our Alumni Week sponsors, Geico, College Advantage, and Skyline Chili. And of course, all of you. Thank you again for being with us today. I know that we have all gotten used to using Zoom, but it is always good to share a few housekeeping items. We will be keeping everyone muted to avoid any potential feedback and to make sure you can hear our wonderful speakers this evening. We invite you to turn on your video, as it is in this virtual world, it is always great to see your smiling faces. This session will be recorded and shared in a follow-up email and posted on our YouTube page. Following the interview, we will have about 10 minutes for Greg and Michael to answer questions. If a question occurs to you during the interview, I do invite you to share it in the chat, as I will be monitoring the chat and will make sure it gets asked during the Q&A. So let's get started. I'm thrilled to begin our program this afternoon by introducing Liz Scarpelli, the University Press and Publishing Services Director for the University of Cincinnati Press. Liz is a veteran in the publishing industry with over 30 years of textbook and scholarly book experience. She moved from the lower Hudson Valley of New York to Cincinnati in 2017 with two of her three sons, her dog, and parents to launch the UC Press and Cincinnati Library Publishing Services, where the focus is innovative, interactive books in social justice, academic community partnerships, and regional interests. As the director of the press, Liz has created a thriving publishing imprint for the university, producing 15 books, trade and scholarly books, 6 journals, including Music Research Forum, Focus on German Studies, Visual Languages in Teaching and Research Learning, and numerous student and faculty proceedings. Under her leadership, the press has also become an important employer for students at the university, providing jobs for 6 undergraduate and graduate student interns each year. She received the university's Staff Excellence Award in December of 2020, appears regularly on publishing industry panels, and most recently recorded a podcast on the innovative publishing of the UC Press. She will also receive a master's degree in higher education administration from UC at the end of April. Welcome, Liz.
Thank you, Maggie. Just had to mute. So I wanted to welcome everybody here today to our virtual author event, sponsored by the foundation, co-hosted by the University of Cincinnati Press. As Maggie says, I'm Liz Scarpelli, founding director, and I also serve as the director of the press and the acquiring editor, which means I had the privilege of finding this wonderful author and wonderful book that you will hear about in a little bit. Our press was founded in 2017 by Dean of the Library, Shima Wang, and myself, with the intention of publishing works of general interest and scholarship on social justice, academic community partnerships, and regional studies. Our mission is to publish books which are commercially available online and in physical bookstores, like the one you're going to see today, as well as using innovative publishing tools to bring authors closer to their readers and bring them together. Our books showcase the best scholarship and writing from UC faculty, from Cincinnati authors, and from scholars around the world. For some books, that means creating resources that add to the reader experience. For other projects, the University of Cincinnati Press has created interactive and enhanced books which allow the authors to present additional research, audio, video, and data on their book right within the pages online for free. The community pages allow readers to enjoy, engage, and even write comments to other readers and back to the author, right when they engage with the content. The Speaking Stone Stories Cemetery Tells is one of the many books with a community page. And I think Maggie's going to drop that link right into the chat now. This community page shares some short videos that showcase Michael Griffith taking viewers on a tour of 6 of the graves discussed in the book, as well as an interactive map that shows the location of 28 of the sites mentioned in the book. I'm most excited that we had our two of our interns work on this. And it's a wonderful opportunity, and why they call us a teaching press, because we do provide transferable skills for our students, both undergraduate and graduate. Everyone will also get that link again in a post-event email that will go out to them. Today's event shares a wonderful set of literary nonfiction stories by award-winning UC Arts and Sciences professor Michael Griffith. Michael is not only a UC professor of creative writing, fellow of UC Graduate School, and winner of the Graduate Student Mentorship Award. He is also the author of several fiction and nonfiction works, which have appeared in numerous publications, including the Washington Post and Southern Review. His book Trophy was named one of Kirkus Review's best novels of 2011. He's the fiction editor for Cincinnati Review and founding editor of Yellow Shoe Fiction, published by Louisiana State University Press. I met Michael 4 years ago when I first started the press, and since that time pursued him as a potential author. After patiently waiting 2 years, Michael was ready to offer the University of Cincinnati Press his manuscript. We were overjoyed. Earlier this year, The Speaking Stone Stories Cemeteries Tell received a Kirkus review, which described the book as containing poignancies and mysteries alike. Entertaining. Author Brock Clark describes Michael's writing as a one-of-a-kind way of telling stories, wise, funny, and deeply humane. Today, Michael will be interviewed by the one and only Greg Hand. Greg is the proprietor of Cincinnati Curiosities blog, dedicated to keeping alive the weird soul of the Queen City. He's a regular contributor to Cincinnati Magazine and to WCPO's Cincinnati Lifestyles show. Greg and I first met in 2018 when he became a University of Cincinnati Press volume editor for From the Temple of Zeus to the Hyperloop, University of Cincinnati Stories. Greg started out working as a reporter and editor of the Western Hills Press, after which he then joined the University of Cincinnati for 36 years, where he provided public relations and communications counsel to the University of Cincinnati. In addition to his books of essays, he also has authored or edited 3 additional books about the University of Cincinnati. And he's an inaugural member of the University of Cincinnati Press's Community Advisory Committee. It is my pleasure to welcome both of these men to the virtual stage today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you, Liz. And thanks to everybody for being here on a gorgeous day.
So, Michael, you've created a real problem for me because I don't know where to put this book. It belongs in the section that I keep reserved for especially well-written books that I can study for style. It belongs in my collection of Cincinnati-related books. It belongs in many cases, it belongs in the philosophy section. You've got so many layers in this book. And in fact, you create layers by going back and referring to the book as it's developing. This could not have been an easy book to write.
Thank you so much for that. It's awfully kind of you. It means a lot coming from you because you, as I mentioned earlier, you know more about the subjects I'm writing about than I do by a margin of 1,000 to 1. But it's kind of an unclassifiable book. It's a hybrid, part ramble, part reflection on various things, part local history, part reluctant memoir. The the irony of all that is it was by far the easiest book for me
Is that
of all the
right?
books I've written. And I can't really explain that. You know, it's a book that I apologize for how complicated this origin story is, but it's a book that came out of my teaching. I am primarily a fiction writer, and often I talk with students about the expectation they have that there's one true and proper way to write a story or a book. There's almost like there's one magical straight line through the material from intention to narrative. And you know, my experience, on the other hand, is that it's not about finding the path, it's about finding a path. And one of the many joys of it as a writer or a reader for me, they have to do with spontaneity and accident and openness to the fact that your plans are going to get ruined and changed along the way. And so I was teaching a class 4 or 5 years ago about the links between walking and narrative. And we started with the peripatetic philosophers, and we went through modern philosophers like Rousseau and Nietzsche and Kant, Hobbes, all of whom were big walkers. Hobbes, I think, even carried a special walking stick with a pen concealed in it so he could take notes. And they all employed walking as a tool for thinking. And so we talked about that. We talked about the Romantic poets, who, of course, famously employed thought of wandering as a central part of their poetic practice. And so what I was trying to urge my students to do is just be alive to the fact that digression is okay. There's no such thing as this one simple path that narrative has to follow. You need to be following some path that leads somewhere, but you don't have to be thinking about destination all the time. And so when a couple of years later, I was working on my own book, which is a novel set against the backdrop of the decline of the American newspaper around the turn of this century. And it was about an obituary writer and a puzzle deviser, which is another hobby of mine. And I was just stuck. I could not make any progress on the book. And so I thought, why don't I put my philosophy into practice and start taking walks in Spring Grove, which is right. I live in Northside, so it's quite close by. It's been a place that's been special to me for a long time. And I thought, I was thinking magically in a way, like maybe by osmosis, if I play hooky from this book by walking every day for an hour, I'll magically, it'll rub off on me in some way.
Now that's a question that I had after reading the book is the logistics. So you're obviously walking through Spring Grove, but did you walk to Spring Grove or take the car down there and then take the walk? Or
that's actually that's a complicated question. I mean, I live probably on a straight line. It's probably 25 minutes to the front gate. So some days when I felt like when I had a couple hours, I would walk to Spring Grove and then walk Spring Grove. Some days I would drive down just to the corner of Northside and walk in the front gate. That was probably more common for me. But yeah, it was really, part of this is another accident of all this is that I acquired my first smartphone right before this. And so, I wandered into the cemetery one day and I saw a stone that's on an artist palette in the form of an artist palette. It was on a path I'd been by 100 times and I'd never noticed it. And I realized, oh my God, I have in my pocket this way of doing a bit of instant research. And so I Googled this Belgian-born photographer, Leon van Loo, suddenly found myself plunged into this wild story about him and thought, oh, I think I'll do this on my walk every day. And at first I didn't think of it as a book. I thought of it as an amusement. I thought of it as a distraction. I thought of it then as something I might write a couple of blog posts about. And then suddenly, as the things that you said happened. Like I started seeing layers and I started seeing it as an opportunity to write a different kind of book. And so that's really how it got started.
It is an amazing structure that you have. In fact, you teach creative writing, and And I've always felt that we English majors got cheated. You know, the economists have their microeconomics and macroeconomics, and English majors don't get, for instance, micro style and macro style. But within this book, you've got amazing examples of both. You know, on the micro style, it is obvious that you love words.
That's
The
true enough.
I was collecting your unwords for as I was reading. Start off with ungress, and somebody is described as having an unschnoz, and a wall is unplumb, and then you get into the taphophiles, the
Mhm.
cemetery lovers, and uh, just examples like queasy quasi and necropolitan. And I could just tell, here's a person who loves not only the wall, but each individual brick. And you give a clue about that with your description of your hink pinks.
Mhm.
So
So
is that a thing?
it is. Hink pinks are a bizarre thing. They're tiny rhyming puzzles. I was introduced to them by my colleague Chris Batchelder, who had seen there was a guy named Dylan Hicks, who's a musician and writer in Minneapolis, who was serving as the puzzles editor for Paris Review, and he created a bunch of these puzzles. And my friend Chris knew that this was a rabbit hole that I would instantly fall into, and he sent it to me. And what they are is they're rhyming puzzles that my favorite Dylan Hicks example is something like Hazard County Kingpin's dental hygiene record. And the way it works is that hink pink is if it's one syllable on each side of the rhyme, it's a hink pink. If it's two, it's a hinky pinky. So this is a hinky pinky, and the answer is Boss Hogg's floss log. So that's the way those puzzles work. And I got obsessed with them one summer, and I must have must have written about 500 of them in a single summer. And yeah, I've been doing some puzzles for the Southern Review recently, and I did about 50 of those for them. I did some for Cincinnati Review several years ago as well. It's a bad habit.
So then that's the micro style, but then we have the macro style. And one of the reasons why this book is so difficult to categorize is the profound narrative arcs that you're able to develop. The probably the least flexible objects in the universe are gravestones, but you use them as diving boards that go off into these amazing recursive arcs as the story develops.
Well, that's such a kind and generous way of putting it. I appreciate that. I mean, I think I say early in the book, there's a kind of my mantra as I was starting this book is there's the writer John Barth wrote an essay once in which he said that we live in an ocean of story, and no matter where you drop your bucket, you're going to haul it up teeming with whatever there is. And that was what I found to be I had always believed that to be true, and I thought this was a test of that. And so it's just the thing about Spring Grove is it's so wonderfully rich in history and in these deeply imbricated, complicated, interrelated histories. And I just felt like no matter where I dropped my bucket, no matter what stone I looked up, it was going to connect to a number of other issues that I cared about and that were interesting to me.
And not to get into inside baseball for the English majors who are listening in, but I also thought this book is a stunning example of what Keats called negative capability, the ability to dive into a lengthy meditation on something without requiring closure, or it just really plays out in amazing ways. You follow, in fact, you describe it as a rabbit hole. Some amazing pathways that lead through it's about Spring Grove in a way, but you, to get to Spring Grove, you have to go through Obituary, a meditation on obituary that brings in Flaubert and everything, the biography. You can't do Spring Grove without history, but autobiography, you mentioned reluctant memoir. This book hangs together because of your autobiography in it. Is that something that you planned, or did it just develop?
Now, that part was not at all part of the plan. I mean, initially I wanted no part of any sort of memoir. But as I went in, I realized, I mean, and I had one of my colleagues, Dave Stradling, and my friend Brock Clark and I were talking about this one day. And Dave, who's a historian, wanted there to be no autobiography. Brock wanted there to be a good bit more autobiography. And I wanted to be able to have access to the subjects I wanted to talk about. I mean, among them race and gender and, and what we leave behind, the idea of art, the idea of obituary, the idea of funeral marker or grave marker. These are the things that we leave behind as we try to make ourselves last. So what endures? And I wanted to be pondering in one way or another what endures in every essay. And I realized that there was no way to do that without entering into the texts occasionally, without making myself a little bit vulnerable in those ways. I mean, most conspicuously, that's the case in the last essay about race. But, but I mean, I realized there were some of these things that my own history was going to have to enter into. And I realized there came a point in the writing of the book where I realized that the introduction was going to have to be about the sort of state of unrest and anxiety that I was in that led to the book in the first place.
And the autobiography, it's kind of interesting. There's, I won't say so much, but it's an odd collection. You come out of the book thinking that you know a fair bit about you, but when you actually look at what shows up as autobiography, it's only two or three facets of what must be a much fuller life. So,
oh no, my life is totally empty. It's all there.
Well, I'll tell you, your life was interesting enough that it's being a bad influence. I'm trying to talk my friends into adopting the bender.
Oh, I miss those days. Yeah, so the bender is, when I first came to Cincinnati, I mean, I came to Cincinnati from Baton Rouge, and I'm from the South. I had never lived in the Rust Belt. I'd never lived in a city that had a whole lot of history. And it was one of the things that I liked immediately about Cincinnati. And several friends and I started doing this thing, our excuse was that we were getting to know the town. But we started doing this thing called the Bender. And it was a couple writer friends, a couple historians, an urban sociologist. And what we would do is we would pick a neighborhood, and we would go to that neighborhood in the morning. We would have a late morning breakfast, and then we would have one beer in each of 3 or 4 bars in the neighborhood. And what we discovered was that if we went on weekdays in these old, shot in a beer bars in, dying industrial neighborhoods, there was a 100% chance that the proprietor would be the bartender, because who would pay anybody to be in an empty bar at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday? Right. And that was such a great education for me about the city and about what was going on in the city, what the city's history had been, not just what the city's brewing history had been, although I was interested in that, but all sorts of things about the city. I mean, there's a story in the book about there was one bar just south of campus that's now been bulldozed. And we went in there and the guy was showing us his back patio, and there was an old car in the back that was hemmed in by walls that could never be removed until they raised the building. And there was a tree growing in the back seat of that car, I remember. And he said, "Here, I want to show you something. I've got a plan." And he had there was an old shuffleboard court out there, and he had set up a version of cornhole. And instead of a board, there was a toilet at either end. And he had devised these foam rubber things that looked like poop. And you were supposed to throw from one toilet to the other toilet. And he kept, before he would tell us about this or show us his plastic poop, he made us promise that we would reveal it to no one because it was proprietary. By God, it was proprietary. He kept repeating the word proprietary, proprietary. I don't want you. This was clearly his retirement plan, and he didn't want us to rob him of his 70s in Florida. And now I've done it. Now I've ratted him out. I'm hoping that the statute of limitations has passed.
Well, to paraphrase Yogi Berra, is an oral NDA worth the paper it's written on? So.
True enough.
But the reason I bring it up is this idea of going around the city and exploring the city in such an interesting way, I think has contributed to kind of the framework or the infrastructure of your book, because Spring Grove is sort of a microcosm of the city. And as you take these adventures out of Spring Grove and into the larger world, I hate to label you as an immigrant, but that's the way Cincinnati works. You've got a pretty good understanding of the city.
Well, that's
your pieces fit together very well.
That's good to hear. I'm glad to hear that. I'm a little surprised to hear it. I think one of the pieces is one of the things that was a recruiting aid for me to Cincinnati was when I was here for my interview. When I interviewed here, I'd never been to Cincinnati. I knew nothing about the city at all. But for the 2 days I was here, every local newscast led with and had 5 minutes on the story of a cow that had escaped from a slaughterhouse down on just off Spring Grove Avenue. And the cow went by various names, and it became this cause celeb in this community. I remember reading there was an interview with kids who were being driven by their parents up to near Mount Storm Park in Clifton to look for the elusive. The cow managed to stay on the lamb for 9 days or something like that, and kids were out there, driving up near Mount Storm to watch it. And it was it was clear that it was a city that loved its own history, that was deeply interested in its own history. My background academically began with German, and I was especially a student of Vienna, which is a city that is obsessed with its own past. And so that was something I'd always been interested in. And Cincinnati does strike me as a city that's Vienna-like in the ways that it's just deeply, deeply invested in and interested in its past. And that was part of the appeal for me.
I remember the cow. I happened to see the cow on my way to work that day. And I was in the public relations office at UC. There were all these writers writing up news releases. And I said, take the day off. Nobody's going to cover anything except this cow today.
Well, Moudini, as she was called.
So you just called Cincinnati Vienna. And I know a great number of people who are going to love that. Emilio Estevez just got a little bit of heat for calling Cincinnati the Paris of America.
We're a good bit closer to Vienna.
Piling on Yeah, people piling on apparently didn't realize that he didn't invent that he was quoting somebody from the 1800s. I think Vienna is good. Now you mentioned you mentioned the last chapter. It's actually what the second last chapter is the heart and soul of the book. This is the one where your journey really emerges. You know, you describe early on the book as being fundamentally about the role of retracing and coincidence and surprise connection. And here's a book that it starts out with Kevin Bacon,
Mhm.
and it ends up with kind of a global philosophy on approaching and dealing with race relations and history, and it's magnificent the way the way that it develops, even though you've described it as a series of dodges, as if you're avoiding that question. How did that magnificent chapter emerge?
Well, thank you so much for that. I mean, that was the hardest chapter to write in a dozen ways. In part for the reason that's kind of inscribed in the whole notion of dodges, that I knew where the chapter was headed. I knew there was going to have to be a kind of, that it was going to involve a kind of deeply uncomfortable personal reckoning with, with race. And, but I mean, I knew that also that, I wanted it to be a kind of, to exemplify the model of the whole book, which is, I mean, the idea is the Kevin Bacon reference has to do with the whole notion of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, and which is a game we used to play. I have a student who told me that she and her friends used to play a game called 6 degrees of Hitler. I think it was called 3 degrees of Hitler. And the idea was there was no Wikipedia page that you could find that you could not reach Hitler in fewer than 3 steps from. And the so I wanted to think about that it's from I think a Hungarian writer named Corinthi, who came up with the idea of this degrees of separation back in the 20s. And I was thinking just about how interconnected the world has become in so many ways. And the fact is, the degrees of Kevin Bacon, I couldn't find the idea of the degrees of Kevin Bacon has to do with any actor or actress who's appeared in any film can be connected to Kevin Bacon in fewer than 6 steps. I couldn't find anybody you couldn't connect in 2.5 or 3 steps. And so the idea is, as the world gets closer and closer together, and what are the implications of that? How does it work? And so the idea was, I saw a gravestone for a guy named Jonathan Silly in Spring Grove, and there had been a dorm at the high school I went to called Silly, and I associated it with a young man who was 3 years younger than I was. His name was Edmund Perry. He was an African-American student from Harlem, and I didn't know Eddie well. I mostly encountered him because we had to drop our laundry off at the same time. He was 3 years younger than I was. I was only there for a year. He was a freshman. I was a senior. But I knew of him. I'd played basketball with him a couple of times. And so, I mean, I was always aware of him. And he died. He was killed by a policeman in New York right after his graduation. He was headed to Stanford in the fall. And I was an undercover cop, and the story was, and I have no reason ultimately to disbelieve the story. The story was that Eddie and his brother jumped the police officer, and that what was happening in some way was that he was no longer, whenever he came back to Harlem from this Tony New England prep school, there was pressure on him to be able to indicate, hey, look, I haven't gone over to the other side, like to reprove his bona fides. And so there's a lot of reflection in the essay about, like, in a way, like foolishly and idiotically, I thought of myself as like a fish out of water in just the way that Eddie Perry was. Only the ways that I was a fish out of water as a hick Southerner, and the ways that he was a fish out of water as a young African American man from Harlem were totally different. And so like when I went home to get back in the good graces of my friends, I had to stand around the back, the trunk of a car and drink a couple beers. It's like, it became this reflection that is occasioned by Silly, and then there are all kinds of wild stories about Silly and the various Sillies and so on. Ultimately leads to this kind of reckoning with the idea of privilege, essentially, right? And I had a friend years ago who wrote this really interesting book on what he calls the Southern racial conversion narrative. And the idea there was that Southerners who used to be conservative and who have become liberal on race, this was mainly in the 40s and 50s. There's a thriving subgenre of autobiography in the South through the middle of the century, especially, of people who have these "was blind but now I see" narratives, like it's Saul on the road to Damascus, and like they're always told in the same way. They're like, I used to be in error, but now I am right-minded, and there's always in there some reckoning with like the self-congratulation that's part of that, right? And with the fact that it's always in these explicitly religious terms. And so I was, I wanted to talk about that and talk about, what it was like as a kid who grew up in the 60s and 70s in very rural South Carolina, and, and who at the time when these events were happening, I didn't reflect on them with anything like the kind of moral depth that I would have liked to think I had, but clearly didn't. Not that I have it now necessarily, but I felt like it was something I had to reckon with.
Oh, it was. I'm calling it a magnificent chapter. It's almost like the ascent, the pinnacle of the book. But the thing that really impressed me is throughout the book, you had come across a variety of circumstances suggested by things in Spring Grove Cemetery that related to the city's evolution of its racial consciousness. And when you hit this chapter where it is so personal and so powerful, and in many ways so tragic, suddenly those earlier references come clear. And this is, for me, where it really tied it into not only your personal evolution, which you do not portray as conversion, as just an ongoing evolution, but make it clear that the city has to go through that sort of evolution as well. And that's where suddenly it's not just personal, it moves out into the broader society. That was very impressive.
Well, thank you so much for that. That's an extremely kind reading of it.
So you've got all these people. I mean, you managed to bring in the courthouse riot. You managed to bring in the Cincinnati arts community. You managed to bring in the Civil War generals. There's this crowd gathering around. Run across anybody that you didn't particularly like?
That's interesting. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which a project like this, because I had inscribed accident into the whole premise of the book, like the only case where I sort of slightly cheated was I knew that Fanny Wright was buried in Spring Grove, and I was always on the lookout for her grave. But otherwise, I wanted it to be, these are things I stumbled across and people I stumbled across. And, a project like this one is going to self-select for white, male, rich, because it's a wealthy cemetery and a lot of 19th century barons, and because of the politics of the time. It's also going to self-select for people that I like in some way, or that I find interesting and interestingly complicated in some way. I think the person in the book that I started out disliking most was there's a chapter about, I got interested in all the stones in Spring Grove that are either petrified wood or
Oh,
that
yeah,
are
yeah.
form of logs. And one of the other things that I had not thought about is that books like this are going to self-select for peculiar name, because it's a whole lot easier to look up, somebody with an unusual name than somebody who doesn't have one. And so it turns out that one of the petrified wood stones is for a guy named Charles Miller. And there's a long thing in the book about how I
Right.
went through about 40 Charles Millers before I found the right one. And he was I forgot what the term was, but he was the administrator of the insane asylum in Cincinnati. And I found him, he was a really kind of nasty customer in some ways. He was pretty self-righteous, really sharp-tongued. And so, I mean, I went into that not feeling very much sympathy for him. But by the end of it, the thing that seems poignant to me in the end is that he's buried in this grave with his brother and with his daughter, whose name was Lulu Miller. His wife at the time ended up marrying someone else, and she's actually buried in Spring Grove about 400 or 500 yards away with her second husband. He had been divorced during the middle of this. He'd been through all kinds of controversy. This was the really ugly era of insane asylums in the U.S. And Longview was not an exception in these ways. There were all kinds of controversies during his tenure there. But what I discovered toward the end of my research is that his daughter Lulu, who died at 19, I think, and very early in his tenure at Longview, she had been sitting in a window in their house and had fallen backwards out of the window and been paralyzed, I think. And part of this, I think, precipitated his divorce. Lulu was never healthy for the rest of her life. She ended up, I think she may have survived her father by just a few months and died at 19. But I mean, suddenly I was, anytime I had any kind of temptation to sit in judgment of anyone or to feel smug, I would discover something that complicated that person for me. And for, Miller was somebody I was inclined to find kind of villainous, and ultimately I couldn't, again, the more you dig, the more to know all is to forgive all, or to know even a little bit is to forgive even a little bit.
Was he the guy who reporter was trying to get in touch with him and he wouldn't come down from his upstairs window?
No, that's another person who doesn't come out very well in the book. That's a guy named Frederick Airman, who was a physician.
That's right.
He was the physician for a young woman. She's somebody I to my knowledge, no one's ever written about her because, I mean, she's not a known person, but there's a stone very close to the front of Spring Grove that just says Carrie on it. And it's about 25 feet from any other stone. And I wondered who that was. And I discovered it was this young woman who died just before her 18th birthday, when she was going to come into a small fortune that her father had left her, and dug into that. And it's a complicated story, but her case was not very well handled by this doctor, who was quite high-handed when the reporter came to talk to him about it.
There you go. Well, it looks like we promised all of our guests that after half an hour we would open it up for questions, and we're at about that point here. I don't see anything in the chat, but
no, if people feel comfortable unmuting and asking a question, please certainly, do that. Like you said, Greg, there were no questions in the chat.
Okay.
Right now.
But as you can see, Michael is quite proficient at handling anything thrown at him. So this is your opportunity.
This is Diane. I have a comment more than a question, and I just have to say that Greg, of course, you and I know each other from committee work, and I have to say I guess I didn't realize that you were going to be the interviewer, and you two, as Maggie and I were saying, you two are just brilliant together. I mean, you are the two of you are so simpatico, and you made this just I'm always thrilled to get to take part in something that UC is doing. There's just always such great educational value, but this was beyond entertaining. I mean, you guys are funny. What a way to spend a Sunday evening. Thank you. Thank you. A million times. Thank you. I think that you really, no pun intended, but you brought the book to life. Talking together. I was thinking, Michael, when you were talking about, going on a walk and where you're ending up, and I was thinking, oh my God, your walk was on the way to death. Into a cemetery, walking our way to death, but really great. Really, thank you both a million times over. It was just wonderful.
Yeah, there's a, I was thinking about the famous last line of Bartleby the Scrivener, which goes, on errands of life, these letters led to death. It's for, the book is the inverse of that. On errands of death, all these things lead to life. I mean, that was the thing, is that was, kind of the central cheap irony of the whole book. All my work hinges on cheap irony, but just the idea of, I wanted to go look for life and connections and energy, and, what better, oddly, what better place to do that than a place like Spring Grove?
How did you feel about the young military woman who had her SpongeBob headstone turned around?
Yeah, I mentioned that briefly. I mean, my emphasis in the book is on older stones. I do mention her. That's just an awful story. She was a young military veteran, African-American woman who was murdered, I think, in some out west somewhere by her live-in. And then she was buried in Spring Grove, and she loved SpongeBob, and she had a SpongeBob stone. I think her sister also died very young and also had a SpongeBob stone. There was this was before I came to Cincinnati, but or before I was aware of it anyway. There was controversy about whether it was properly, the tone of the SpongeBob thing was proper for the cemetery, and it became this kind of proxy war for, for all kinds of not very pleasant things. And I think what they ended up, the solution they came up with was they put up some kind of blank wall so that people who need it suitably somber don't have to see the SpongeBob, but the SpongeBob could stay.
Actually, they ended up putting on the other side at their expense a great piece of writing that she had done.
Oh, really?
That's
fantastic.
Absolutely. I mean, sort of, I thought, put it to them in something, poetry that she had written before she died. I thought it was just totally amazing and how appropriate. So I wondered if you had seen that and where that took your head.
I've not seen the bit of writing. I'll have to look at that. That sounds fantastic. I mean, part of this book actually came, from the idea, Greg mentioned obituary, and the part of the start of this, and he mentioned Flaubert, was I read in the New York Times, I love obituaries and have loved obituaries for many years. And I read in the New York Times an obituary about this guy named Alexander Courage. And Alexander Courage was a writer of TV and film music. His most famous composition by far is the theme to Star Trek. And that's music that's just absolutely ubiquitous. I mean, it appears everywhere. But Gene Roddenberry, who was the creator of Star Trek, wrote lyrics for that song that have never been used. And in fact, they are mind-numbingly dumb. They're just absolutely awful lyrics. But the idea was that he would get then 50% songwriting credit. And so 50 cents of every dollar that would have ever gone to Alexander Courage for it went to Gene Roddenberry. So when Courage died, Margaret Fox of the Times wrote this obituary that not only told this story, but to my delight, quoted in their entirety the terrible lyrics that Roddenberry wrote for that song. And it struck me as like an act of revenge, right? And Flaubert had said in the 19th century that he wanted to see biographers who would write as if they were taking revenge for their subject. And so that idea of like, idea of like having someone who's such an advocate for you that they're taking revenge for all the slights that you endured in life, like that really appeals to me. And that's exactly what you're talking about with this stone. Like, I mean, I love the idea that the people who complained that this was not a proper stone for a proper tone for a cemetery. I'm glad I will immediately go out there and find her stone, which I know vaguely where it is, but I'm going to go out there and see if I can't find the poetry. Thank you for letting me know about that.
Maybe your next book could be titled When Courage Died. It could be a political essay, just saying.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I talked to Liz about is that I love the idea that this is the project could be replicated almost anywhere, right? I mean, it's, the fact is it could be done in almost any cemetery anywhere. The idea is wherever you go, you look things up, you're going to discover there are riches there, and there are fascinating things. I mean, I was aided in this by the fact that Cincinnati's an old enough city that there were, the Inquirer was a really good resource for me. But I mean, I wanted to make sure that the research I did for this book could all be done from my house. I did not ever leave the house or the cemetery to do any research. Everything had to be doable on my phone.
I was just going to mention, Michael, I think some of our viewers would find it interesting to think about how you went about some of that research in the last couple of minutes we have left, because you pointed out to me many times that this was not the quintessential or the de facto group of people to be researched in the cemetery, and that, as you just said, truly anybody could do this. So, if somebody were going to either walk through Spring Grove and replicate this or go to another cemetery, are there, 2 points or tips that you would suggest to them if they were going to try and embark on this?
Well, I mean, I was fortunate, as I said, in that the Inquirer has available online a digitized archive of everything over the last, or virtually everything over the last 170 years. That helped a lot. But I mean, yeah, I mean, as I said, I wrote about a couple of people who are well known, but most of the people I was writing about are not well known figures. They may have connected with well-known figures in one way or another, but and as you said, it's really, for me, what I basically did was I wandered through looking at names that either struck memories for me, that I recognized the name, or it connected to something that I had read or that I knew, or names that were just interesting and unusual. And obviously, I mean, I must have spent 5 or 10 minutes researching 500 or 600 stones, and then you see which ones open up into fascinating things. And so, at least once a day, I would find some stone and think, oh, this connects with all kinds of interesting things. I mean, I think it's really just a question of curiosity and openness to finding connection. And then once you find connection to, what all does this lead us to? I mean, I know in one case, I got interested in casket manufacturing of all things, and because I had discovered somebody and I realized that because of Spring Grove, in part, Cincinnati became one of the centers of mid-19th century funerary design and coffin design, handles, all kinds of eventually hearses and wagons and so on. And all that led eventually to the fact that when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, 3 days later, November 25th, 1963, the same day, in the picture, in the book, there's a picture of John Kennedy saluting as his father's cortege passes, that famous picture. Also the day that the Eternal Flame was lit in Arlington. that day, the crime scene, the car arrived home in Cincinnati on the back of a flatbed truck. That it was something I had never known at all, had no idea about. And all the things that ended up getting connected to that were just deeply interesting to me. It was something that I stumbled across because I got interested in, I got interested in this peculiar Egyptian-looking coffin that had been made by a guy named, company named Breed. What's it? Breed and
Crane,
oh, I'm sorry.
Crane and Breed.
Crane and Breed, right?
Yeah.
Somebody asks about the Gypsy burial sites. This is not something that's in the book, and I bet Greg knows a lot about this. I don't. I mean, I know that supposedly the king of the Gypsies, this is a term we don't use anymore, but the term that used to be used, died apparently in Cincinnati. And so, what is and every Memorial Day is it? What is it, Greg? How does it work?
Yeah, every Memorial Day, and the lush carpets of flowers on all the graves. But that's one where it's a little out of my sweet spot. I kind of fade out after 1920, but I've encouraged several people working on Cincinnati folklore to look into the details.
I have seen large processions of cars headed in at the end of May, and as you said, I've seen the flowers, but I don't really know that much about it.
So just to say, I'm going to weigh in here just because I do this on things like this. It's the Romani people.
I know they're the Romani.
So we want to be really careful.
Yeah, I know, it's absolutely right.
Yeah, there's something fascinating about that, Greg. Have you ever seen there is an economist in Cincinnati who predicts the economy for the following year based on the grandeur of the memorial flowers that are done, and the person is almost always right. And
is that right?
Yeah,
I had not seen that.
It's a professor. But those are really interesting because they really are, to use the word that we were talking about earlier, they really are biographical. The floral arrangements, the extravagant floral arrangements are biographical about the person who is buried there. So it's a very loving kind of thing, but the economy, I think, makes it really interesting.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, I would love to, that is something I'd love to research, because I'm not sure, I'm not sure what the history of the Romani is in this area. I mean, I gather that this person who was buried was from far away, just happened to be traveling through Cincinnati. I mean, I think maybe these processions come from quite far away, but I really don't know very much about it. Ann Steinert says there is a scholarly article about the Memorial Day flowers. So that's something we could look up. Thanks, Ann.
We might have time for one more question if anyone has one before Dean Wang kind of closes out the program for us. All right. Dean Wang, Shimo, do you want to go ahead and wrap up the program for us?
Sure. Very brief. Just want to take this opportunity to thank the people put this program together. I'm Shimo. I'm a dean of the libraries and also the vice provost for digital scholarship. I'm making this the closing remarks and thank people also on behalf of my co-chair, Buck Niehoff. He and I jointly chair the UC Press Advisory Committee, which is one of the organizations we put together this program. So thank you, Greg and Michael, for the wonderful discussion and the conversation. I learned so much about from your conversation. I certainly learned the Spring Grave Cemetery is such the living history museum, of course, with all dead people. Michael, I see the way you started to make the stone speak is good metaphor And I see the opportunity for the further books, research books. I certainly also see the opportunity for the History Channel documentary or even the Hollywood movies. I certainly look forward to finish my reading of your books. I just started, have not finished the book. Congratulations, Michael. Your hard work paid off, and I'm very happy and to welcome the Speaking Stone to the UC Press growing catalog. This marks UC Press's 15th published book since its inception in 2017. It will join the press's other books celebrating and examining Cincinnati history, its people, and its community, like the Candace Moore's and Nancy Breman's book on Maria Longworth's story, and Kathy Albright's book on exploring the architecture of place in American farm market. Thank you, Lit, Scarpelli, and the press team for making this book a reality, and congratulations to press's continued success. I also want to take this opportunity to thank those members of the UC Press Committee Advisory Committee who join us today, Press Faculty Advisory Board, my Dean's Advisory Council member, as well as the Weekend Center board member who are able to join us today. Your support is so important to our press and to our library. Thank you, Bach Niehoff, for joining me to organize this talk, and also thank the UC Foundation team, Maggie and Mike Hogan, for your support. And finally, many, many thanks to all of you giving up the wonderful weather to join us online today. With such a success talk and discussion, we will organize more such author talking event with press in the future. I look forward to seeing you, everyone, hopefully in person next time. Maggie, I think I'm not very much close to today's event.
Yes, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening, and hope, like Shimo said, we hope to see you in person soon.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks
Thank
for
you,
being
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
here.